Hello, if you are new here, welcome to our channel. My name is Mary, and this is the Save the Deaf and Endangered Languages initiative where we talk about sign language, deaf people's rights, and everything that you need to know about deaf people, their language, their culture. So, in this series, we're going through a couple of very important discourses on multilingualism, and if you've watched our previous video, you've seen the introduction to that topic. In case you've not watched that video, you might want to check back on our YouTube channel and watch multilingualism video presented by Dr. Emmanuel Asonye, and I'm sure you would love it. So today I will continue the same discourse but look at it from a different purview. I'll look at multilingualism in indigenous African deaf communities, but I'll consider the challenges and opportunities that multilingualism presents to deaf people in Africa. In case you do not know, Africa as a continent itself is linguistically diverse. We have over 2,000 languages used across Africa, and as multilingualism has its advantages for the African continent as a whole, boosting inter and intra-community communication, being a source of economic bedrock, and also for education opportunities, it has its own challenges. And the challenges of multilingualism is even quite difficult for minority languages like indigenous African Sign Languages. So let's first consider some of the advantages of multilingualism, and then we'll look at the disadvantage in relation to indigenous deaf African community. So the first advantage I would like us to consider with deaf children or deaf people living in multilingual communities, the different linguistic repertoires such people have access to. And I mean, yes, because deaf people are able, as you've seen in our previous video, to acquire different languages in multilingual environment. So it could be the sign language of their local environment and the sign language for education. In maybe the case of Ghana, it will be Ghanaian sign language used in education. If you are from a village like Adamorobe, it will be Adamorobe sign language used for the intra-community or in the village. Some deaf people go ahead to even acquire another sign language such as the American Sign Language, which is spearheading all over the world and is becoming a global sort of lingua franca for deaf communities. So obviously, if such a deaf person, a deaf child, a deaf adult is exposed to these different languages, their linguistic repertoire increases. So they're able to communicate with deaf people from different linguistic backgrounds other than their own communities. The ability to sign or use different sign language also aid in education, because most of the time the sign language for education in most indigenous African communities is not the indigenous sign language used in the communities, the urban sign language. So if you have knowledge of two or more sign languages, if you go to school or if you are enrolled in an institution for the deaf, it gives you an advantage. Also, the language of commerce and business is mostly tied to the urban sign languages, which will probably be different from the indigenous sign language the deaf child, the deaf person is used to. So being able to adequately use two or more sign language actually bridges the gap between the deaf world in a community and the deaf world in another community. So it brings two deaf people together. Deaf people are able to create acquaintances, build friendship, and have a lot of connection going on because they do understand each other. It's like me being a Ghanaian raised and born in Ghana and now living outside Ghana. My ability to speak English is able to help me transcend beyond my environment of Ghana to speak with people who also speak English, which happens to be a global lingua franca per se in our day. So if a deaf child has the knowledge of different sign languages, there are advantages involved: educational advantage, business and commerce advantage, communicational advantage, building friends, building different group of communities around, and being able to navigate through the society without being limited to the one language that you know. On the other hand, multilingualism, as we said, can also pose a couple of disadvantages to deaf people in different places across the world. Our focus on this channel is to focus on a deaf child growing up in an indigenous African community. So let's look at some of these disadvantages. So the very first disadvantage I want to talk about is the impact on the sign language used in indigenous deaf communities. So if a new language happens to be the preferred by the deaf community, then there is a likelihood that the indigenous sign language itself used in the community stand the risk of endangerment. And how does this happen? If all the deaf signers decide to sign in the urban sign language that has power for business, for education, for commerce, for connecting them to people of different backgrounds, there is a likelihood that they would abandon their own sign language and then migrate to use the new sign language. In other words, there is a potential language death for their own sign language. And in most times, governments of such countries that are multilingual focus on the majority languages to the neglect of minority languages. Sign languages in general are minority languages. So imagine an indigenous sign language, which is a minority within a minority. When it happens that way, there is a likelihood that the attention will be given to the urban sign languages, documenting them, developing materials for them, and making sure that they are trained interpreters, that there is linguistic documentation going on, to the neglect of the indigenous African sign languages, which are left without any attempt to do anything to their language, no documentation, no research. So on each day, a minority language in the world goes on extinction, and indigenous African sign languages are no exception. Our conscious attempt to be multilingual and to prefer the urban sign languages leads to the death and sometimes the total extinction of the minority sign languages. And I'm sure you and I do not want our languages to be extinct. Aside the languages dying out, becoming moribund, there's also a stigma tied to indigenous African sign languages in environments of multilingualism. And this happens when people perceive these indigenous sign languages as mere gestures or pantomimes instead of as real human languages. I don't need to go into details with sign languages being real languages. If today is your first time visiting this channel, you might want to watch some of our previous videos, because sign languages are full-fledged human languages like English, like Spanish, like Akan, like Yoruba, like Igbo. So we don't need to even argue with that. But there is this stigma when it comes to my multilingual environment where people think their languages are more preferred and indigenous sign languages are looked down on. And it happens so subconsciously that even the users of the languages, that is the indigenous African sign languages, are even looked down on. And to avoid being stigmatized, they might want to use a language that does not come with stigmatization, which could be the urban sign language, or to make even a more drastic attempt to lip read the spoken languages in the environment. I might not be able to discuss all the disadvantages of multilingualism in Africa, but one of the things I want to pinpoint when it comes to deaf communities and deaf people's language rights is the fact that not every deaf child growing up in a multilingual environment has access to the urban sign languages or the urban spoken languages. So what happens is when they go to school, there is an issue with accessibility. The language of education is entirely different from the language they know and use. And when it happens that way, the deaf child's education is stalled. There is no progress. The deaf child goes to class. It's like sitting a Ghanaian child in a school in Spain and teaching that child Spanish. The Ghanaian child might be able to speak and understand English, but Spanish will be an entirely different language to the deaf child, to the Ghanaian child. Similarly, when deaf people or deaf children who have just one sign language, which is the indigenous sign language in their community, go to school and they are immediately exposed to the sign language of the urban community, we indirectly deny them access to education, because they will be in class without being able to understand everything that is going on. Sometimes it might take a couple of months or sometimes years for them to become full bilinguals in the urban sign language together with their own sign languages. But in those years, their education would have been stalled, their progress would have been limited, and they will not be at par with their colleagues in other institutions who are using languages that they know.